Chapter 28 of Genesis tells the story of a crucial moment in Jacob's life, when he had a profound encounter with God in an unexpected place. After deceiving his brother Esau, Jacob was fleeing his home in fear of his brother's revenge. Alone and far from everything he knew, Jacob fell asleep in the desert, with only a stone as a pillow. It was in this scenario of uncertainty and vulnerability that God decided to reveal himself to him. This text is much more than a simple dream. It is the moment when God reaffirms his promises to Jacob and, through him, to the people of Israel. Jacob was on the run, leaving behind everything he knew. He had deceived his father, Isaac, and obtained the blessing that was intended for his brother Esau. Fearing for his own life, Jacob was forced to leave for Haran, the land of his ancestors. This escape was not only physical but also emotional. He was vulnerable, full of fear and uncertainty about the future. At this moment of crisis, Jacob was completely alone, without direction or comfort, carrying the weight of his choices. At dusk, in the middle of the desert, he stopped to rest, using a stone as a pillow. This scene conveys an image of complete helplessness, since he did not even have a suitable place to rest. However, it is at times like these that God usually manifests himself in surprising ways. Jacob's solitary desert would be the stage for one of his greatest encounters with God. This moment of rest, which could seem like an ordinary pause, actually marked the beginning of a transformation in his life. God would reveal to Jacob that, even in his flaws and weaknesses, he was present, ready to redirect and transform him to fulfill his purpose. While Jacob slept, God surprised him with an extraordinary dream that would mark his life. He saw a ladder or a ramp that went from earth to heaven, with angels of God ascending and descending it. This dream, described in Genesis 28 verse 12, was not just an ordinary vision, but a powerful representation of the connection between the divine and human worlds. For Jacob, who was on the run and felt isolated, this image was a reminder that he was not alone. God, through this dream, was showing that heaven was not some distant and unreachable place. There was a direct connection between man and the Creator. The ladder that Jacob saw is full of spiritual meaning. It symbolizes the bridge between heaven and earth, a connection that seemed impossible but was now revealed. This pathway between the human and the divine points to God's constant interaction with the world. The angels ascending and descending the ladder represent God's activity on earth. They were messengers, servants who carried out God's orders, and they demonstrated that God was not distant but deeply involved in human affairs. For Jacob, who was fleeing his family and facing an uncertain future, this vision was a clear message that God was present in his life, even if he didn't realize it. Often, like Jacob, we go through times of great difficulty, feeling alone or distant from God. We may not physically see a ladder connecting heaven and earth, but the truth is that God is always close to us. Jacob's vision reminds us that even in our most difficult moments, God is still active, sending us help and guidance. He does not abandon us in the middle of the desert, but is right there with us, ready to intervene and guide our steps. The ladder that Jacob saw also points to something deeper, the promise that God is accessible. In the New Testament, Jesus refers to this ladder when speaking to Nathanael, John 1 verse 51, saying that he would see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Jesus is the true bridge between heaven and earth, the one who connects us directly to God and grants us access to his presence. Like Jacob, we often fail to recognize that God is close to us in our most difficult moments. He is at work in our lives, sending his messengers and providing what we need, even when we do not realize it. Jacob's dream teaches us to trust that even when we are in the wilderness, God is always with us, guiding us and revealing his plan on our behalf. In the dream, the Lord stood at the top of the ladder and spoke directly to Jacob, a deeply meaningful moment. God introduced himself to him as the Lord, the God of Abraham and Isaac, connecting Jacob to the spiritual legacy of his ancestors. This introduction was not just a formality, but a powerful reminder of the continuity of the divine plan. God was affirming that the same commitment and promise he had with Abraham and Isaac also applied to Jacob. This personal encounter with God was a turning point in Jacob's life. Until then, he had been living a life marked by deception and escape, without fully realizing the role God had for him in fulfilling God's promises. By identifying himself as the God of Abraham and Isaac, the Lord was making it clear that Jacob was part of the great plan of salvation and that he, God, would be the guide and protector on his journey. God's promise was not just for the past, but for the future. By reaffirming his covenant, God was assuring us that his blessings were not limited to Abraham and Isaac, but that they would also extend to Jacob and his descendants. This teaches us about God's faithfulness, who never abandons his promises, even when we fail. Jacob, despite his mistakes, was being called to fulfill a vital role in God's plan. This moment reinforces that God does not forget his covenants. He is faithful, and his presence in our lives does not depend on circumstances or who we are, but on who he is. Just as God was present to guide Jacob, he is present in our lives, ensuring that his purposes are fulfilled, regardless of the challenges we face. God, in his faithfulness, reaffirms to Jacob the promise he had made to his grandfather, Abraham. He declares, "The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your descendants after you." Genesis 28 verse 13. This is a promise of land ownership and the continuation of the covenant God had established with Abraham and Isaac. God was guaranteeing that the land where Jacob lay, a foreign territory to him at that time, would be given to his descendants. This land, known as Canaan, would become the homeland of the people of Israel, the fulfillment of a divine promise that had spanned generations. In addition to guaranteeing the land, God promises that Jacob's descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth, a powerful metaphor that highlights the immensity of the blessing. They will spread out in all directions, north, south, east, and west, indicating not only the extent of the physical territory but also the spread of the spiritual influence of Jacob's descendants. This points to the multiplication of the people of Israel, but also, more broadly, to the influence of the plan of redemption that would come through them. The most profound aspect of this promise is the universal blessing. "And in you and in your descendants all families of the earth will be blessed." Genesis 28 verse 14. This promise was not limited to the people of Israel alone, but had global implications. Through Jacob's lineage would come Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, who would bring salvation to all nations. This promise foreshadows the coming of Christ, the promised descendant who would bless all the families of the earth, fulfilling God's plan of redemption for all humanity. God's promise to Jacob reminds us that his plan of redemption is always in motion, even when we don't understand or clearly see how he is working it out. Jacob was on the run at that moment, afraid and uncertain about the future, but God was showing him that there was a much greater purpose behind his journey. Likewise, in our lives, we may not understand God's ways in difficult times, but his promises remain steadfast. He remains faithful to his plans, working everything toward his will, and like Jacob, we are called to trust him, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. In Genesis 28 verse 15, God makes a powerful and personal promise to Jacob. "I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land." For Jacob, who was fleeing in fear and uncertainty, these words came as a balm of reassurance. He was no longer alone on his journey. God not only had a plan for his life, but he also promised to be there every step of the way, protecting him. This promise of divine protection is one of the most comforting in the Bible. God did not limit himself to making distant or vague promises to Jacob, but assured him of his constant presence. He would be Jacob's guardian wherever he went until he returned to the promised land. In the wilderness, in the midst of his escape, Jacob may have felt fearful and vulnerable, but God was reassuring him that his protective hand would be with him at all times. This shows us the personal care of God, who does not abandon his people in their moments of crisis. God's promise of protection to Jacob teaches us a great lesson about divine faithfulness. Often, in our moments of uncertainty, anguish, or fear, we can feel helpless, just as Jacob did at that moment. But God's message is clear. He is with us, guarding us and leading us through difficulties. He never abandons us. Just as he promised Jacob that he would bring him back to the land, God guides us back to the place he promised us, protecting us in all circumstances of life. God's presence is our greatest security. Even when we feel like Jacob, running away from our problems with no clarity about the future, God is present, assuring us that his care is constant. Divine protection does not mean the absence of problems, but the certainty that God is with us, going through the challenges by our side. When Jacob awakens from his dream, he is deeply impacted by the experience he had. Amidst fear and awe, his first words are, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." Genesis 28 verse 16. Up until that moment, Jacob had been running away, seeking safety in the midst of a situation of fear and uncertainty, without realizing that God was with him all the time. This awakening was not only physical but also spiritual. Jacob now had a new awareness of the divine presence. He recognizes that the seemingly ordinary and even uncomfortable place where he slept was actually sacred. The place where he had laid his head on a rock had become a place of encounter with God. This recognition is significant because it shows the transformation in his heart and in his vision of the journey he was undertaking. The lonely desert, which had previously been only a temporary refuge, now became a place of profound divine revelation. Jacob's fear and reverence in the face of this experience reveal the impact of being in the presence of God. He declares, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven." Genesis 28 verse 17. This realization teaches us that God can manifest himself in the most unexpected places and times. Often, in our own deserts, times of loneliness, hardship, or uncertainty, is where God reveals himself in a powerful way. He transforms desolate places and situations into moments of blessing and divine encounter. This part of Jacob's journey reminds us that God is present in all circumstances, even when we do not perceive him. He is not limited to temples or sacred places. He can manifest himself anywhere, at any time, and transform the deserts of our lives into holy ground. Just as Jacob was awakened to this reality, we too are called to open our spiritual eyes and recognize God's presence in our own journey. After his life-changing experience, Jacob gets up in the morning and performs a powerful symbolic gesture. He takes the stone he had used as a pillow, sets it up like a pillar, and pours oil on it. This act of consecration represents the recognition that this place is not ordinary, but sacred, for there he has encountered God's presence in a tangible way. Jacob then names the place Bethel, which means house of God. Genesis 28 verses 18 to 19. By setting up the stone as a landmark, Jacob was establishing a physical symbol of his spiritual experience, something that would serve as a reminder of his encounter with God. This pillar would be a landmark on his journey, a constant reminder of God's presence and promise in his life. The act of pouring oil on the stone reinforces the idea of consecration and dedication to God, a gesture of respect and reverence for what this place now represented. Bethel became not only a geographical but also a spiritual landmark for Jacob. It was the place where he realized that God was with him, where he received promises of protection, blessing, and the continuation of the divine covenant. Bethel symbolizes a turning point in Jacob's life, a moment when he began to better understand God's plan for him. Furthermore, the name House of God underscores the notion that wherever we are, especially in times of crisis and loneliness, God can manifest himself and transform that place into a sacred meeting place. This experience at Bethel teaches us about the importance of having milestones in our faith journey, times or places where we encounter God in a special way. Just as Jacob set up a pillar at Bethel, We too can set up spiritual memorials in our hearts, reminding us of the times when God has revealed himself to us, guided us, and blessed us. These milestones strengthen us to move forward, knowing that God is present in our journey. After the amazing revelation at Bethel, Jacob responds to the experience by making a vow to the Lord. In Genesis 28 verses 20 to 22, he declares that if God will continue to keep him on his journey, provide for him, and allow him to return in peace to his father's house, then the Lord will be his God. This commitment by Jacob was not just a conditional promise, but a demonstration of growing faith and recognition that God was actively involved in his life. In making this vow, Jacob was beginning to understand that his life was not just the result of his own efforts or plans. He acknowledged God's sovereignty and his dependence on him for protection, provision, and guidance. The experience of encountering God in a moment of great vulnerability made him realize that he needed more than just escape from Esau. He needed God's continued presence. In addition to promising that the Lord would be his God, Jacob also committed to giving God a tenth of everything he gave him. This act reflects gratitude and obedience. Jacob's tithing symbolizes his acknowledging that everything he had and everything he would ever have came from God. This offering was a way of honoring God and demonstrating his covenant faithfulness. Jacob's vow shows us how a genuine encounter with God transforms our perspective on life. God's protection and blessings are not something to be taken for granted. They require a response of commitment and devotion. Just as Jacob made a vow, we too are called to respond to God's grace with a committed heart, acknowledging his sovereignty and providence in our lives. He recognizes that if God will continue to be with him, keeping him and sustaining him, then the Lord will be his God. Jacob commits himself to following God and honoring him with all that he has.